Welcome to the Two Bridges, One Bypass podcast. I'm your host, Jimmy Woodson. All right, well, we're definitely laying down a track now.
Well, let's go.
Yeah. So
what do you got for me, Jimmy?
I don't know. I don't have much tonight.
Okay.
We do have Tycho.
We do.
And once again, we're live from Studio 7 at the worldwide headquarters of the Two Bridges, One Bypass podcast. Tonight, Josh Everett, really quite the mystery man.
That's right.
So many questions I have for him. He's straight from work today. Where were you working today?
We were working back in Wanchese today. We were at a few boat shops. We were doing some projects with John Bayless at Bayless Boat Works and finishing up some projects with Ricky Scarborough at his shop. And we have some things going on in our studio. So we were divide and conquering today quite a bit. We were sort of all over the place.
That Ricky's a new build, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's a 70, maybe 72 footer for a client named Mike Standing. He owns a boat called the Waterman. So this will be his second Waterman. He's kind of up in his game. It's a really nice project that he's working on.
So the first Waterman was Ricky boat.
Correct.
How big is that one? Do you know?
I think that might have been a 62, maybe a 65, something like that. And Mike and his group, they travel a lot. They like to do Dominican Republic, Mexico. You know, they travel, and I think they needed a little bit more boat for some of their excursions. They like to stay on the boat. So I think that boat is kind of more for their long distance trips, you know.
It's hard to have enough boat,
I guess.
when you can't see land.
Yeah, really, it's tough for him, I guess.
So I guess let's get into a couple things that I like to ask at the beginning of the podcast.
Sure.
Like, where are you from?
I was born in Pennsylvania and was moved at a very early age out to Colorado, where, you know, I kind of consider that's where I was raised. I was there from when I was about, I guess, maybe 6 or 7 years old until I finished high school and moved away to travel and go to college. So I was raised in Colorado, but my family's primarily from Pennsylvania.
Gotcha. Yeah, I remember the Colorado now that you mention it.
Mm-hmm.
How about movies? What are some of your favorite movies from any genre?
Whew. Well, you know, I'm kind of all over the map with movies. You know, I mean, I'm a huge comedy fan. I'm not a horror flick guy. You know, I even like quirky, like romantic comedy stuff. But I'm a huge fan of documentary work too. You know, so I like documentary, but I also like strange, sort of eclectic cult classic type works too. You know. It seems like a lot of the stuff that comes out now is pretty formulated, so it's kind of hard to find movies nowadays that, you know, come off as like unique, you know. There's not too many Dr. Zhivagos out there, or sort of these classic movie themes that just repeat themselves, right? You know.
Yeah, Nemo 8 and whatnot.
Yeah, you know, any movie that like the end of it is like a number, the second or the third or the fourth, you know, I kind of get lost after the first one. Which
several exceptions, like Godfather 2.
Well, you know, it's kind of those are different. You know, that's different.
Right. It's back Dr. Zhivago-ish, where you had large studios, and say what you will about large studios and them controlling what goes on the screen, but I guess now the paradigm has changed, and it's riskier to do something that may fail, and you put $30 million into it, and I guess they just don't have the juice anymore to do that. I don't know, but you're right.
Well, it seems more like a numbers game now. You know, the film companies are trying to pump out volume. Also, you know, there's a lot more film. You know, people want to be entertained more. You know, the whole dynamic of even watching movies has changed. You know, people I think now use it as a big vehicle to escape from whatever in their reality. You know, I mean, I don't watch TV at all. You know, I mean, television is just depressing, and it's a big mind suck, you know. So I'd opt out to watch a movie. But, you know, I'm not going to try to spend that much time dedicated to watching anything, you know, because there's a lot of stuff in real life to do that you can kind of watch in real time and create your own stories, right? You know.
Right, when you're younger and perhaps you do have some time to kill and you're not, you know, knee deep in your own business and getting things done, you have a little more time to kill.
Sure.
And make it happen. Tell me what kind of music you've been listening to lately.
Ooh, it's funny. I've actually been on this crazy Fleetwood Mac kick like the past week or so. I've always been a fan of classic rock. I grew up around it. My parents were pretty much beatnik hippie types, so I grew up around that type of music, and my mom was a musician, and I was around musical people. So that was my earliest exposure was, classic rock and sort of the folk stuff. And, but for me growing up, I early on got into, alternative music styles, punk rock specifically in the early 80s. And it sort of paved the way for a huge part of my lifestyle and led me into a few of my careers. And it was a huge part of like my early life was punk rock music and the whole scene, the whole culture behind it. But I've always been exposed to a lot of different music. So my musical tastes kind of go around in these big circles, where changes happen through, climate change, like weather. I'll listen to one type of music during a season will change and it'll shift what I'm listening to. One of my favorite new bands that has stuck with me over the past, maybe 10 years or more has been a North Carolina band called the Avett Brothers. And huge fans of their work. They've become a bit commercialized, but I still like their catalog quite a bit, sort of folk Americana style. My musical tastes have really mellowed out over the years. When I was younger, it was very aggressive. There was a lot of angst. I was into really heavy stuff. But nowadays, like I said, I've been on this Fleetwood Mac tear, just going through the whole catalog and just loving that. And it's just, there's kind of this melancholy story to it. There's an overtone that I kind of relate to at the moment, too. And it's just my speed. Being the wintertime, you kind of go into this hibernation. Everything seems to slow down. The motivation isn't quite as there. So, like this, that soft tone sort of works well with the season, right?
Yeah, a little calmer.
That's
maybe
right.
Time of year for us.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
and live music, so like live music is my thing. And I don't think there's any bad live music, to see people performing live and watch people practicing their art is like the paramount of enjoying music, right? And you get to see the way people react in a crowd, and I react. It's just something comes over me when I see live music. So I enjoy going to see local bands, like Zach Mexico and some of the guys that play around the beach here. I've always been a fan of, and I'm not a huge partier. I don't like to go out and hang out, but I love to go out and see some music or go see a concert. The live performance experience, there's nothing like it.
Right, be out in public, be with a group of people.
Yeah, and that energy, that group energy that happens, there's a certain synergy behind it, right?
So how do you listen to the music? Do you download it? Do you buy vinyl?
So yeah, I used to collect vinyl, and I had inherited vinyl collections through my parents, through just moving and a chain of events. I kind of gave up on vinyl and switched over to CDs and some of the portable medium that was available. But past few years, everything I do is Pandora or Spotify or digital. But Spotify is incredible. I mean, you can open up full catalogs of music. You can target things specifically. You can get attached to playlists to take you down rabbit holes to find new music to stay current. I really enjoy too listening to new music. I think as humans we age, right? And you meet a lot of these people that are not open to new music. They get stuck in a zone and they don't go beyond that, and they become these old curmudgeons that are the guys that say, oh, well, that's not music, or whatever. And it's like, well, you've closed off you've closed off your mind. You've lost your open-mindedness. So I enjoy new current music, and I like to try to keep my finger on the pulse of that, by staying current, it and what's happening, and you relate to that sound. Your finger stays on the pulse of what's happening in society a little bit, because I think what happens with music, is kind of transcends what's happening in the world around us, right? Because people are expressing, people that are musicians are expressing something that's important to them, and then they're conveying it in a beautiful way that speaks to us, right? So like listening to new music and listening to trends and changes in music are great. Like, music in the 80s was very weird. It was like this glam rock and new wave, and there was, it was like this post-disco thing and punk rock, and I look back at that music that I was exposed to. It was kind of a dark time for music, really. And even into like the whole grunge rock and then what became popular with the Seattle movement and the alternative scene. What it's become now has kind of come back full circle. People are playing some really beautiful music now and writing some really neat stuff. But I sense I sense like bits and pieces of influence from, other music types in today's music. But I think today's music right now, a lot of the stuff that's coming out is really good, and a lot of it becomes art. So, music isn't necessarily meant to make you just happy. It provokes a response. Like that was the deal with punk rock. Punk rock is not designed to make you dance like a happy person and feel all happy. It was this aggressive energy and very explosive. So you still hear that in a lot of modern music, a lot of modern rap themes and things rappers are singing about aren't provoking necessarily a happy response. It's like a call to action type of thing, right? Melded to a beat that people can connect to, so everybody can have that connection. So I think that type of music is very interesting too.
Before I forget, I feel obligated to mention that I found a guy on YouTube who's I think he's around about 50, and his last name is Beato. It looks like beat with an O, Beato, and he's got a bunch of videos up. But one thing that he does is what makes this song great. For instance, Rush, Limelight. That's the last one I watched. So
Neil Peart just died. Yeah.
And Neil Peart just died. This is like the
Best
third
rock
podcast
drummer
Rush
of
has
all
come up
time.
on out of now the 8th one. So what he'll do is, and he's in his studio, and he can play everything, and he's like, he'll talk a little about it, and then he'll start with the intro, and what he'll do is he'll break it down, things we can't hear.
Right.
Things we can't hear. He's like, what we've got here, and then he'll split the tracks up. Okay, so here's the lead guitar, and then here's what's behind it, and it'll be like a 12-string or something, or Neil Peart doing a little filler or something. People, if you love music, check it out, and it will open your eyes. And then when you hear that again, you're like, oh yeah, here's that part where he talked about where they played the guitar track and then they played it again, and then they just put a little bit of reverb on them, and then they played them again at the same time. And
it resonates with you.
Yeah, and it's just different. You don't know what it is. And then he talks about time signatures a lot changing.
Right.
Instead of bump, 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 it'll be bump, 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 bump.
Yeah,
It'll
like
change
like a dissonant, like a jazz beat thrown in.
Yeah, and then it's hard for us that don't know music to know what to think, except that we like it.
No, and that's it. And that's kind of like the point of art. When you look at good art, it's hard for the non-trained eye or the non-trained ear to identify what it is they like about it. Either it works or it doesn't work. I think I've spent my life as a creative, so I live in this realm where, if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it demands explanation or you need to explain to justify what makes it good, you've missed the point. Either it hits you and it resonates with you in music, or it doesn't. In art, it either hits you and you're drawn to it, or it doesn't. But I think, very good technicians that practice the creative crafts, know how to create these combinations that work. And to the unskilled eye or the unskilled ear, we don't even know it. It just affects us in a right way, and we go, oh, that sounds great, or that looks good. But, we don't give the credit to how much thought and how much sense it makes, from a technical side.
Yeah. Yeah. Guys like the Beto guy, he's like a dog. He doesn't just smell pizza. He smells dough. He smells the bread. He smells the tomato. He smells everything
has that
separately.
Trained eye. Yeah, you can break it down and explain the theory behind why it works. And in art, so for me as a visual artist, it's the same thing. Like the way my eye is trained is I can look at things and break down and tell you why something works or why it doesn't work. It's the whole process of critique. Why do you critique your work? So for me as an artist, not to get off subject, I have to do that with my own work too, because that's the only way you progress. So I think with musicians or visual artists or anybody that are creatives, they have to be their own worst critic. They have to look at life with a critical eye, not dwell on where the successes are, but look really strongly at the weaknesses. What makes it weak? How is that work juxtaposed to what does work? And what do you need to do to make the next new thing? How do you do something new? Everything has almost been done, right? So like what is the next new thing? How do you make something fresh in music, in art, in the creative realms, in today's day and age, I actually kind of see the complexity being rolled back in visual arts. You see more simple themes that people are gravitating towards. The idea of old world masters paintings. People aren't painting like that anymore. We have cameras now. The photo obscuro killed the concept of people having to be portrait artists. You don't have to pay a guy to paint a picture of you or your family. You just take your phone out and you take a picture, and there it is. You know what I mean? So, art has, I think, simplified, and people, people kind of lead in packs, right? So you sell them something, and then they go, oh, yeah, we like this simplified thing. And I've noticed the same thing in music. And it's funny. So I was talking about Fleetwood Mac. Their music is stripped down to a very essential, like it's just the essential information. It's very basic. When you listen to what they've done, they have sort of taken a less is more approach, and I think cognitively stripped away every bit of excess material. Like there's only the notes that are needed to create the music, and then the voice speaks the way it is. It's a very simple thing. I think, we've explored, we had these Renaissance periods in art and music where we pushed it as far as we can. And I think right now in a lot of the arts, we're pulling back. Like you look at modernism and it's very simplistic. You look at the way people decorate their homes. It's not as ornamental. People are going to minimalist approach, and more neutral color palettes, earth tones, and neutral type things, right? So, I don't know. We'll see what it looks like, in the future, if it keeps going that way.
Yeah, even in designs of houses, there's TV shows that are like The Small House or something like that. Like, how minimal can I be? How simple can I live my life?
Right, because we've done the complex. You look at the history of architecture, and you had what was it, Doric, Ionic, and then Corinthian capital styles. Corinthian being the most outrageous. Sort of these floral patterns, and
Right.
really exploring the possibilities of what we can create. And then since then, it's become this process of stripping it back down to, let's just build a cube, and make it really warm and comfortable in that cube, and just set this theme where you're just you're in this womb that is your cube, right? Without a lot of distraction, right? Mm-hmm. So what does that do though? So aesthetics affect the way your brain pattern is. And so for me as a painter, one of the things I learned is that if I'm in a studio with a lot of clutter and a lot of things around me, or there's chaos around me, I have a hard time getting my creative process to start working, because there's all this sort of static around me that's, keeping me from creating clarity, right? So by us being in this phase where we're looking at things more simply, does that allow our brain to function in a better manner? I don't know. We're in this sort of technological era too, where it seems like people's attention is focused, and especially in kids, and how their intuitive nature with things like iPhones and computers. There's this sort of paradigm shift happening from the external world and the things that we can build to these internal devices that connect us, right? Technology, and what does that look like 20 years from now, man?
That's hard to imagine. It really is.
Well, watch sci-fi movies. We kind of create what we model in sci-fi.
Yeah. It's unfortunate, but the last podcast I recorded was with a fellow who came up through his career, his education, his career was all, putting graphics on a computer screen and working with people that engineer it and write the software and everything. We were talking about this, and we talked about the show Black Mirrors and how that looks at a very not so distant future. I would even say some of the episodes are today, because the technology that they're talking about and the way it's utilized or manipulated is today. And some of it is utterly terrifying. Some of it is just, why are we so dumb to let it control us that much? But your minimal comment about, are we going minimal? Are we going more minimal because we know that, number one, having things aren't everything, and B, it used to be like that a home was this great investment.
Right.
You bought a home. It was after World War II. You built a home in 1951, and you sold it in 1975, and you sold it for 5 times what you paid for it. Those days are over with.
Well, and the dynamic has changed too. Of the conventional family unit and relationships seem to be changing. The conventional method, people certainly have this wanderlust spirit now too. I mean, travel's become so available to everyone at a cheap cost that we can spend our lives going and out and exploring all these other places. Or if we want, we can pull stakes and go move somewhere else. So the idea of a home and the permanence of a home isn't the same as the way it used to be. The generations of families that all live in the same town, and it's just you stay close to home. And it's kind of funny. I sort of sometimes wonder if we're going to have a rollback to those old times again at some point, where people do become grounded again and just satisfied where they live. I mean, look at where we are here in the Outer Banks. This becomes a very transient place in the winter. Even a lot of the people that live here, it's hard for them to make a living in the wintertime. They work these seasonal jobs, and they have to go do other things in the winter or figure out how to capitalize on the months they can, and then just go do something else in the wintertime, right? Because it gets kind of quiet here.
Yeah. That is interesting. Whether it will roll back to more of a nuclear family. The one thing that I think may edge a bit to that trend is people realizing that there are other ways to make a living without obtaining a college degree. And
I think that's almost the better way these days.
Yeah,
unless you're very focused in going into a trade like medicine or something that requires the background. The college degree today does not have the same value that it did a few generations ago. A few generations ago, if you had a college degree, you were guaranteed certain things. Even if it was as a teacher, you could at least get tenure. Tenure doesn't really exist for teachers anymore. They've become these disposable commodities. So what's the point? I think there's people that are turning back to the trades. I mean, I know where we live and the industry that I work in, boat building, there's very few of these guys that I know that work and do very well as boat builders that have went to college. They trained in trade schools, or they worked as apprentices, or they worked under somebody else, and they've become masters at their trade. And they don't have these massive college debts over their head. And they've been working, and they've learned a skill set that's made them specialized to the extent that they're, breaking six figures. And that's here in Dare County. I don't think a lot of people that live here or people that come to visit here quite understand the gravity of the boat building community and what we have here, the gem that we have here in North Carolina, and how recognized it is in not just, a statewide level or national, but globally recognized as builders of some of the finest sport fishing boats, tried, tested, and true here locally by guys that just figured it out, So it's interesting. I have a huge respect for the trades, and I grew up around it. My dad was a carpenter by trade. My grandfather on my father's side, he was an engineer and a machinist for Boeing. He worked as an apprentice. But the flip side of that for me then is on my mom's side, she was very educated. Her father, my grandfather, he was a doctor. So I got to see both sides of it. And I did both sides of it. I've worked as a tradesman and a craftsman and learned a trade and a skill, and I got to go to college. I got to tap into both of those disciplines. Mm-hmm. But I think nowadays for sure, a lot of people go into college really not knowing what their next thing is going to be. It's just an extension of high school to stay on the part of the family unit. They're not breaking away and becoming independent. It's just an extension of whatever, and they're just spending money for what.
Greatest line ever uttered was in a show that I saw about college. Was in True Blood. Was it True Blood, the HBO show? But I think I got the name right. And
I don't know what that is, but it sounds like a cop show or something.
No, it was about vampires.
Set
down in Louisiana.
All right.
And there was a young bartender named Tara, African American girl, and it was somebody. She was going for a job interview or something one time, and somebody asked her if she ever been to college, and she's like, no. She's like, that's where rich white kids pay other white people to read to them. And I thought for a second, that's so true. You could become, how did Abraham Lincoln had education, but he educated himself too, which was classic for that day, especially if you were in a rural area, you weren't in a large area. Education is out there. It's out there, and you can get it, and a lot of kids are now.
And you don't have to go to college for it. I've some of my best learning happened beyond college. When I went to school, going to college, my college degree looking back in hindsight, it wasn't about the specific information I was learning. It was about stick-to-itiveness, completing a complex task. It was learning how to learn, learning how to problem solve, learning how to map out and go through a long process and see it to an end. The process of learning, I think a lot of people turn that off when they get out of school and they don't think they learn anymore. Well, the careers that I've had and any successes I've had in my life have all been through self-learning, through reading books, through exploring different things. You can self-learn anything you want. I think a lot of people, back from those days, you have a quest for knowledge, and you want to learn. It's kind of one of the downshots to this whole idea of carrying around a smartphone. So, my thing is like, okay, smartphone dumb people, right? Has it enriched our lives? Well, it's made us less, we don't have to remember stuff. Lord knows we don't have to know how to spell anymore. Like, spelling's out the window.
You don't need to know anybody's phone number anymore.
No, you don't. You don't need to remember phone numbers. Your recall. We're not training our brain for recall anymore. Never mind navigation. You don't have to know how to read a map or an atlas anymore. Right. So these things that are designed to make our lives easier or enrich our lives, are they indeliberately making us dumber? Like the smartphone dumb person type of movement. And I kind of have this feeling like, we've created so many amazing things as humans, but it seems like we create them too soon before we're responsible enough to use them. We possess all these amazing things, but it seems like we abuse them or don't use them correctly. I mean, hence the Manhattan experiment. Look at nuclear power and the bombs and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
We've created these things, but then we don't put a good harness on it. We've run rampant with it. And have we done that with cell phones and social media and the internet and this whole, spoon-fed, fast-paced information thing, and people absorb all this going, oh, well, I know everything. And it's like, well, do you really know anything? You know what's kind of streaming in, which you're getting these abridged versions of all the information, number one, if you're lucky enough for that information even to be true, because there's no meter that regulates whether any of that information is actually even true or false.
Right.
Yeah.
So. There's no fact check behind it. It's a lot of quantity, but questionable quality.
Right. And then what does it do to the ego? It creates people with inflated egos because they know everything, because they have this oracle in their pocket that can answer all their questions with maybe false information. Yep. So I don't know.
So I think about 10 minutes ago, I was getting ready to ask you, so the art side of things, when did you really when did you meet your artistic self?
Oh, well, it's always been there. So, I kind of touched upon my family background a little bit. My mother has always been a creative. She was an artist and a musician. My father, he was a creative. He was a carpenter, but he was always building and making things. So I was around my family growing up, mom and dad. I was always exposed to arts. There was always art supplies available. I was always encouraged to make things. I remember as a kid, I spent a lot less time. I didn't really play video games or watch a ton of television. I was given art supplies, and I spent my youth drawing, and a lot. And as I got older and I started developing my skill in high school in the arts, I was like a madman possessed. I would just sit at my drawing table drawing and creating and practicing my skill as an artist drawing. I was drawn to it from a very early age. So I didn't really even make a choice to become a creative person. It was just always there, and as an adult, moving through college, I always knew I wanted to pursue fine arts of some sort. And, really early on when I was first considering college, I was thinking a fine art career and painting, specifically fine art painting. And my mom, she was all about it. She loved that idea. But, my dad, he was very practical and kind of warned me that that's the path less chosen, and it's really hard to make a career as a fine artist. You really have to have talent, and it takes more than just talent. It's luck and timing. And there's a lot of great artists out there that never make it, that are never heard of. Some of the best artists, we've never seen their work. They just didn't have the luck or timing on their side. So he really pushed me more towards a practical career. And his whole thing was like, well, you're going to go to college. You're going to spend this money. You should be able to get a job at the end of it and like have a job. And he made me work. I worked in his wood shop as a young man. I mean, not even as a young man. I'm pretty sure he was breaking some kind of labor laws with some of the work he was making me do. But, I had a pretty strong skill set before I even went to college with some trades and some work in art. I worked in a sign shop through high school and had experience doing signage. I was always painting. I was doing different things. I started exploring tattoos when I was a teenager. When I was 17 years old, I was going and applying for work at tattoo shops, right, before I even went to college. So my dad was really influential to me when I went to school to actually get into a design program, to where I started studying commercial artwork and got to see the different realms that were possible as a creative, but where you could still get a job. And it's funny, he kind of pressed that point on everybody in the family. My brother, he's a creative, but he works as a creative. Both my sisters, same thing. We all kind of ended up pursuing creative jobs. We all went to school. And we studied these things, right? So for me as an artist, like that's all I've ever really done, and it's kind of like, I guess I'm an aesthetic in that everything I've ever done, it revolves around the creative process, and I've had a few different careers. I've made some major shifts, and they all connect in one way or the other. But the one thing that holds true with all of them, it's all about exploring the creative process, right?
Wow, you answered a lot of questions about what you were exposed to, and when and what, how you were exposed to art, given what you do now.
And an art lover.
Right.
I've always been a huge fan of art. Like I said, growing up, I would be more interested to sit and look at art books and collect books, and my parents were good about putting that stuff in front of me. There was a lot of books I could read where I could look at the history and look at catalogs of artists' work. And when I was in school, I would spend a lot of time just in the libraries, just studying art books and studying it. I really enjoyed going to museums when I had the opportunities, and going to art museums and being inspired by real life work. So not just being an artist, but studying art, looking at art, developing that critical eye and learning history. I mean, learning history is a great way to get information to make something new.
Yeah. Learning history is the best way to learn everything. It doesn't matter what you're interested in. The historical part of it, will open your eyes to a lot of things.
It's funny though. Like, okay, so for individuals, that's great, but I have this sort of theory on humans as a whole, or like in a greater sense. It seems like we as humans, what we've learned from history is that we don't really learn our lessons that well from history, because we keep repeating a lot of the really big mistakes in history. Yeah. That are right there. It's like, so what have we learned from history that we don't learn from history as a society? Individually, yeah, it's a great tool.
Yeah.
Collectively, hasn't worked out so good for us.
No, it hasn't. It really hasn't. That the human being has I guess maybe we're just too optimistic. Like, that won't happen again.
Oh yeah, we'll never be living in Roman times again.
Yeah, never. Never. What could go wrong invading Iraq? What could go wrong?
Well, it doesn't matter, because we stay very well distracted. You look at the end of Roman times, they had it was the Colosseum. Mm-hmm. So, there was all these activities for Romans to go do, so they didn't have to see what was going outside the walls of their city, where the Romans were going and try to sack the whole world, and the empire ended up imploding on itself. Well, they just did a really good job of distracting their people by feeding people lions and staging, sea battles in the Colosseum. And you look at our society, we have all these distractions that are created through media, through film, movies, television, music, whatever it is, the stuff that news groups post, which kind of take us away from the bigger picture of what's going on around us. So I kind of repeat that thing. It's like, are we living in Roman times,
Have there ever been more distractions than there are now? No, there's no way that can be, because you're walking around with a distraction.
Yeah.
You're walking around with a distraction.
Yep, that's right.
Sometimes I drive to work without the radio on, and I'm not listening to anything. I'm just driving along, and sometimes it's terrifying. There's no distractions. It's whatever pops into your head. Which may or may not be something you really want to think about.
I think it's a necessary discipline. I think everybody should do it. Call it meditation, call it whatever you want. But I think everybody should sit quietly with their thoughts for a few minutes a day, whether it's in the morning, midway through your day, or at the end of your day. I know if you work in a position where you have to perform a complex task or use your brain a lot, sitting quietly and thinking about your approach and aligning the rhythms of your analytical brain are paramount to the success of your performance. If you're listening to music and talking to somebody on the phone and being distracted by your driving and you got 20 things going on, you don't have the clarity, right? Like that quiet pause is where you prep to do whatever you do really well, you know.
Yeah. My wife asked me to meditate. It was yesterday morning, and she was kind to ask me. And I said, I can't do it. It's too terrifying thinking about sitting there for 10 minutes this morning just alone with my thoughts.
Well, you never know. If you did that, next thing you know, you might be doing yoga and all kinds of crazy stuff, huh?
Who knows what might happen?
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Where did you go to college?
I went to a small state school in southeastern Pennsylvania called Kutztown University, and they had a really good design program there. And I had an art teacher that, when I was in high school, went to that same school. And strangely, I was part of this thing called the Governor's School, where, you know, in high school, I got to go study at a college level, and you know, they rewarded a lot of scholarships, and I had some opportunities to go to some different schools, and I kind of had my sights set originally on some pretty fancy schools in New York City, and there were some scholarships available and things of that nature. And I took a different track. I took some time off and went and traveled. Like I said, I grew up in Colorado, and I ended up moving down to St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I was introduced to sailing. I was introduced to surfing, kind of changed my life and changed my thought patterns a little bit. So instead of going to a school in a big metropolitan area like Philly or New York, I ended up going to this design school in southeastern Pennsylvania, Kutztown University. That was a suggestion from one of my art teachers, that it was a really good design school. And it was a great education. You know, I was in and out in 4 years, got my bachelor's degree, and you know, went on from there. In sort of a weird twist, you know, I didn't go into the career that I thought I was going to go into, but you know, it all worked out.
Yeah. So walk us through that. So, you know, you get your diploma, you throw off the hat, and you're rolling. Brand new graduate. What did you do?
Yep. So, you know, at the time, when I was in school, I was tattooing as a professional tattoo artist. My job when I was in college was I worked at a tattoo parlor. Well, this was back before tattoos were in vogue. You know, it was still pretty much a subcultural movement. And my involvement and my interest came through punk rock music. A lot of my teen idols and icons were all tattooed people, you know. So I was into that whole idea. You know, I liked it. It was, you know, I gravitated towards it. I got into it. I mean, I was getting tattooed then. And I started to learn the craft, and I was asked to come work at a studio in when I was in my first year in college. So I worked as a tattoo artist all through college, and that was my job, at a biker tattoo shop. It wasn't glamorous. You know, I worked with some pretty interesting people, to say the least, you know, and I got pretty good at what I was doing, and it was in a small town, and it was a great job, you know, and I really enjoyed it. I didn't think that I was going to pursue tattooing as a career post-college. You know, my idea was to go get a job as a designer doing graphic design or something in typography, or working with a big firm, or getting into major motion picture and film, or doing something to that effect. You know, I was good with using my hands, and I had good carpentry skills. So I was thinking even maybe set carpentry, becoming part of the, you know, the stagehands union, one of those type of careers. Well, I did get a job right out of school with a company called Applied Automated Engineering Corporation as an in-house designer, and I wore slacks and a sport coat and a button-up shirt, and it really wasn't me, you know, and the work was really dry, and I was just kind of doing this boilerplate computer work, and it was a great company, don't get me wrong, they do interesting stuff. It's a firewall security company, they have government contracts and things of that nature, but I didn't last there very long, to say the least. So I returned back to tattooing, and just out of college, ended up opening up my own studio in the town where I actually went to college. Well, right about that same time, they made tattooing legal in New York City. It had been illegal in an underground movement since I believe the 50s. There was a massive hepatitis outbreak in New York City, and they blamed it exclusively on tattooing. Never mind the fact half of the city had a drug problem, intravenous drug problem. So it was run rampant with hepatitis. So they just said tattooing's illegal. So it was this underground culture for a really long time. There was a few people doing it, but not that many. Well, right around the time that I graduated, like circa 95, something like that, they were making tattooing legal again in New York City. And I had some friends in the city, and they approached me and said, hey, would you like to come and help us open up, you know, get the studio started? called Rising Dragon under the Hotel Chelsea in Manhattan in Chelsea. I said, yeah, I'd love to. So I sold my shop to another local tattoo artist, and I moved to New York City. And that was the beginning of a 10-year career and 10-year span spent in New York working as not just a tattoo artist, because as soon as I got there, I started exploring other arts and started doing freelance design work and set construction and set design and signage and a variety of other things, a little bit of fine art. But the backbone of my career while I was there was, working as a tattoo artist, where when I arrived, again, it was the first year tattooing was legal in New York City, so it was this new industry, right?
What year?
About 95, 96, something like that.
Huh.
And it was, for me, I had been working as a tattoo artist in a very small community without a lot of influences or other creative power to draw on. Moving to New York as an artist of any sort is where you need to go. It's the proving ground. It's where everybody comes together. There's so much creative energy and inspiration that flows in and out of there. It's sort of your testing ground, right? So for me as a tattoo artist and being in New York City at that time, it was a very exciting time because there were people flocking there from all over the world. I worked with guys from Japan. I worked with guys from South America. I worked with guys from all over Europe. Ended up years later going to visit and still have friendships and bonds with these people from all over the country. They converged on New York, and it became a really hotbed for creative tattoo energy there. There was a lot of really good studios going on. We were all learning a lot of things. So it was an exciting time, and that was sort of the first generation of tattooing becoming a popular form, right? Previous to that, there were very few tattoo magazines out there. Into my career in New York City, you started to see all this publication around tattooing and exposure. And, it started getting popular to the point of ridiculousness, right? To where it kind of lost its charm to me. And I also realized that, if I was going to continue tattooing, that was going to be it for me. That's what I was going to do. I wasn't going to be able to explore other mediums as an artist. Maybe I could have, but not as a career. That's what I would have been known for. And there was a point in my career in New York where I actually made a bit of a paradigm shift. I was doing some fine artwork, some canvases and things of that nature. And I was always marketed myself as a painter, but I was also a professional tattoo artist, right? And the way people responded to me in my art was different because I was a tattoo artist. I think I shut doors on myself because I advertised myself as having this skill, right? So a few years before I moved away from New York, I started doing paintings and I started kind of marketing my work and running within these circles of people that did not know I was a tattoo artist. I was marketing myself exclusively as a fine artist. And my work became immediately more receptive to a different, bigger, broader audience, right? The fine art crowd, quote unquote, right? So, it kind of made me realize that, what I was doing, even though it was something I loved that much, and, it's how I made my living, and, it gave me a really good life, and I met a lot of amazing people. It wasn't something that I wanted to do exclusively. So I retired from it, and there was a lot of events kind of surrounding that whole retirement. September 11th had occurred. The tattoo studio that I own, McDougal Street Tattoo Company on Sullivan Street, which was in the West Village, was in that downtown zone that was quarantined post 9/11, right? I was in my apartment in Brooklyn and watched one of the planes fly into the World Trade Center, and I watched those buildings fall down. Like, not on TV. I was standing outside watching it in awe with all my neighbors, And that had like an effect on me, like a long-term effect on me, and then I had some family things happen. I had both of my parents kind of fell ill, and I decided to retire from New York, move away from the city, and go take care of my family when they needed me. And that was kind of the beginning of my departure from New York and that career, which then ultimately led to me coming here to the Outer Banks. So that's that part.
Yeah, but how? What was the connection that got you here?
Okay, so my connection to the Outer Banks goes back to my early college days. As I had mentioned, I had moved down to St. Thomas and I had been exposed to surfing, so I started picking up surfing as an art form. I grew up skiing. I was a mountain guy. I skied very aggressively. I was a ski instructor. I thought that was my sport. And then I discovered surfing and was just enamored by it completely. So when I got to college, I met a group of guys, most of which were all from like the New Jersey area, because that's pretty close proximity to where I went to school. And these guys were all surfers. And we were all part of the Kutztown Surf Club. Well, we would take annual trips down here to the Outer Banks, and we would stay down in Rodanthe and Hatteras. We would pass through town, but that's where we would go. And back before they would rent houses to and you didn't have to be 25 years old. They kind of changed those rules. So we would come down every spring. We would come down in the summers. Sometimes we would come down and do strike missions in the winter to go surfing from school. So my mom was alone at the time out in Colorado after I had left college, and she lived way up in the mountains. And she grew up at the beach. She grew up going to the Jersey Shore. So we were having these conversations about, the Outer Banks, and I'm telling her about this place I had been visiting, and she had lived out in Colorado for a long time. Like I said, I was raised there, and she was considering moving away from the mountains and living near the coast. She had never had that opportunity. And her thought initially was she was going to go to the Jersey Shore because that's what she knew when she was a kid growing up. And I said, Mom, you need to come down and check out the Outer Banks. You're going to love this place. And my uncle had been coming down here his whole life with my grandfather to go fishing. So my uncle also encouraged his sister, my mother, to come to the Outer Banks. We took a trip down here together, early 90s. This might be 1991, 92 perhaps. And she immediately fell in love with the place and bought a place in Kitty Hawk, just north of the Black Pelican, right on the beach road. So that became my second home. So when I wasn't in New York City, I was down here visiting with my mom, staying with my mom, surfing here. I mean, this is where I would come to surf. So this was a very special place for me already, and I kind of thought at some point I wanted to live here. I just didn't know how or when I was going to get here. And then, the universe just lays out things in front of you, and you just kind of give into the universe and you go with that, and then you end up where you end up, right? So, after a stint of taking care of family members, and my mom ultimately passed, I decided to stay down here permanently. And that was kind of the beginning of my life here, which was 2002. So a little bit ago, right?
Yeah. 18 years ago.
And I got here, and I knew I wasn't a tattoo artist anymore. I had a lot of interests. Before I'd left New York City, one of my other kind of interests in seeking out knowledge was I was enamored by boats. I was exposed to them. We spent time when I was a really little kid up in Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, so I was exposed to sailboats up there and had the opportunity to sail a little bit. I was exposed to more of it when I lived down in St. Thomas, and I got involved in doing some work on some sailboats when I was living down there, and I got to know how to sail a little bit. Before I left New York, I was a member of the Mystic Seaport in Mystic, Connecticut, and I would visit there quite a bit and go to events, and I knew some guys with sailboats, and I would help them fix and repair their boats, and I started studying sailboat and sailboat building. And my father, as a carpenter, he was a furniture maker, cabinet maker, stair builder. One of his statements, he loved wooden boats, and one of his statements as a carpenter was one of the highest forms of carpentry, one of the highest skill sets there are in carpentry is to be a shipwright. It's a very noble trade. So that kind of stuck with me, right? So when I moved to the Outer Banks, I didn't really have a job. I didn't have a career. And I met some people who were pretty influential down here in the area, and they were involved in sport fishing, and they had boats. And that's when the introduction was made between John Bayless and I. And I went and met with John, and I think I did pretty good with my job interview. And he gave me a job, and I worked as a carpenter with him. And I stayed with him for 10 years or better, working as a carpenter, as a carpentry supervisor, in-house designer, kind of working my way up through the ranks with his company. And it was a great time to be with Bayless Boatworks, too. It was in the early fundamental, developmental years of Bayless Boatworks, when it was a small crew of guys, and our creative input had a lot of influence in the design look of the boats. And even to this day, I think the work that we did in that first decade of Bayless Boatworks defined the brand. And John was really sharp about hiring really good people. So I was really lucky to become a part of that group. So here in the Outer Banks, and the career that I had in boat building was directly responsible from, John Bayless and the person who introduced me to John, which was a guy by the name of Bob DeGabriel. And that's kind of how that sort of went down, how I transitioned into the boat building thing. And I knew very little about fishing. My experience with fishing was, fishing in rivers and lakes and maybe a little bit of shore casting. I hadn't had any experience with offshore fishing. My experience in boats was not in sport fishing boats. It was in sailboats. I built my own sailboats. I'm a sailor. I like the Down East style wooden boats, and I like the traditional wooden boat building methods. So, there was a lot to learn. And again, I consider myself a self-learner, so I just started reading volumes and volumes of everything I could, just gobbling it up. and it was just a very exciting time to work with Bayless Boatworks. And what they do now is still, it's amazing. I mean, they're considered one of the best sport fishing boat builders in the world.
Dang. So I want to get into how you, transitioned into a bit of your work into more art and some of the work you do on the transoms. But you mentioned something back at the beginning about how the Deer County boat builders and the folks from down east and Core Banks. We don't want to leave them out, but
so and
I'm trying to be politically correct.
Let me just clarify. The down east that I refer to is not the down east here, North Carolina
right.
down east. Down east being New England, Massachusetts
right.
down east style.
Like the down east rover that ties up over in Mania. Like that, do you think they call that the down east because that's a wooden boat style?
No,
I'm asking you.
A down east style boat would be more like these boats that are sort of these hybrids between trawlers and presidential boats or presidential yachts.
Yeah.
Down east style wooden boats like the presidential yachts you would see, at the yacht clubs in New England.
Yeah.
At the breakers.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, like the one you could see Roosevelt on the back of with the cigarette
and
in
the
holder. Yeah, and the Kennedys.
That's right.
What I was going to tell you was when you talk about the Carolina Flare and the Dare County boat builders, I took a series of courses over a couple of years, all in this continuum, and there were various different instructors. But one instructor was from Holland, and somehow or another it came up about where I was from. He was like, "Oh, you're from Dare County?" He was like, "Yeah." I was like, "I love the boats, the Carolina Flare. I love it. It's just great." And I was like, "Wow, this guy's from Holland."
No, it's known. It's world renowned, and the way that style was developed, I mean, it was the very early form was not that flare, that developed over time out of necessity, and guys out on the water that would charter fish in the summers and they would commercial fish and build boats in the winter. The commercial fishing fleet and the charter fishing fleet were the same guys building the boats. They were very hands-on, and they would build the boats that they were working on, and it developed into a style that was, function. And the form came from the function of what they could do to improve the performance of these hulls and perform and make the boats perform better in the weather that we have here, which is harsh to say the least.
Yeah.
It happened very organically here. And the early start goes back to Warren O'Neill, right? Okay,
correct.
So Warren O'Neill and then Omi Tillett, who just recently passed away, and Omi is sort of the grandfather of the modern style of the Outer Banks flare, and he was a very inquisitive person. He traveled, he went down to Florida and absorbed a lot of the information of what the builders were doing in Florida. From the Whitakers and the Ryboviches and the Merritts, and he brought that back with him and formed the Sportsman, which there was Warren O'Neill, and then post Warren O'Neill was the Sportsman, and from the Sportsman, all of the builders are somehow connected back to that tree. It reads like a classic family tree, and it all kind of stems from Omi, who was a great guy. I mean, recipient of the Longleaf Yellow Pine Award. I mean, he was a great man. Became a man of the faith. Later on in his life, I had the opportunity to meet him and spend some time with him, and he was an amazing person. But I mean, that guy brought a lot to the history of North Carolina and Dare County boat building, and it was it was all passed down. It was oral history. That's one of the other very unique things about boat building, especially regional boat building. Everything is done differently depending on where you are, and it's all passed down through oral history, through being at the boat shops. It's not like there was a manual. There is not a manual for North Carolina boat building method. Right. I mean, there are manuals out there for boat building, right? And it's constantly changing, but it's been this very family-oriented community. And for a long time, it was just that. It was very much a closed kind of community. You were either part of that fishing community or you weren't. The doors have opened up a little bit just due to supply and demand. The boat builders here now, they need resources from outside here to keep up with the demand for the work that they're doing, because it's not building charter boats for a local fleet of fishermen anymore. The builders here now are building to an international clientele and the wealthy elite, and it just, the stakes have gone higher, and there's certain builders that have elevated the game for everybody. So kind of in sports, you think of like a Wayne Gretzky, right? Or like a Michael Jordan, also a recipient of the Longleaf Yellow Pine Award. Right?
Correct.
So there are people that elevated the sport for everybody. Omi Tillett, he was a guy that elevated the sport for everybody in the fishing boat world. And I think John Bayless, to a large degree, did that too. You know, John brought in a lot of new technology, and a lot of guys did. But I see what John has done, you know, and he was very aggressive in his approach, and he worked very hard as a fisherman before he was a boat builder. You know, so he had the pedigree, and he brought a lot of technology to the Outer Banks that, you know, has changed the way I think a lot of the builders in the Outer Banks do things. You know, everybody's elevating together, right? You know, which makes us better as a whole.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's right. Because those guys were competitive when they were in the cockpit. They were competitive when they were running the boats, and now they're competitive building it. They not in a bad way. They just, you know, everybody's always looking to up their game.
No, they are for sure. And you know, there is such a thing as healthy competition. Mm-hmm. You know, and there's accounting principles that kind of say that what's good for one is good for everybody. You know, so the whole group gets better. You know, I mean, Dare County boat building in a whole has been elevating over the years. Other areas in this country where boat building has been prevalent over time, you've seen kind of not go in that direction and turned away in favor. But, you know, where we are in Dare County, I mean, we've become very recognized as a boat building community as a whole, which is really neat, you know. And it's like a secret. To a large degree, there's a huge community of people that come here, that live here, that know about this place, that have no idea this even happens here, you know.
It's because it's not generic. It's not on every street corner. It's not production.
Right.
You know, and that's the key, you know. And it is relatively exclusive as to who can, you know, afford to buy one and who would appreciate it in the first place. Yeah. How did you go from the carpentry side to
painting?
Yeah, to doing the painting and then the transom work.
To what we do with Everett Nautical.
Yeah.
So it was actually a pretty organic process. I was working as a carpenter with John, and I think I might have been there maybe 4 or 5 years. And we used to have a sign painter by the name of Robert Millfield who would come up from Florida. He was a specialist, and he would hand paint the names on the back of our boats. And I'm going to rewind of more than a few years. When I finished high school and I lived in St. Thomas, I remember walking down a dock in Red Hook, looking at the back of the sport fishing boats back in the heyday of the Boy Scout tournament. And my buddy that I was walking down the dock with, Paul Salazar, he was a mate on these boats. And so we're walking down, and I'm looking at the names on the back of these boats. And I remember saying to Paul, who is the guy that gets to paint the names on the back of these boats? Like, what a cool job that would be, right? Like, it's such a neat thing. You know, they're just so, you get to paint this pretty thing on essentially what is the face of the boat. Even though it's the stern, it's the butt of the boat, but they're all backed in. So it's the first thing you see. Mm-hmm. You know, and as a sign maker or somebody that does signage, like, what a high level to operate on if you're the guy that's privileged enough to be able to lay a gold leaf name or a hand-painted name on these boats. And I remember having this conversation with my friend Paul, and I'm like, 17 years old at the time. So we fast forward back to this moment where Robert Millfield is coming and painting our boats for us. You know, he's kind of the guy. He comes up from South Florida. And I used to go and watch him work. And I worked in a sign shop, and I studied typography in college and worked as a designer in New York. So I knew the skill sets. Like, I understood what he was doing, and I got along great with Robert. So when I would get done with my work shift, I would sit back there and keep him company, and we would talk about stuff, and I would ask him dumb questions. And he'd drop something off the scaffold, and I'd help him, or if he needed something, I'd scurry along and go round up whatever he needed. So I got to watch this guy work and study his method, and I would study it pretty hard and, break it down and kind of I understood the steps behind it, and had experience doing that, not on boats, but in other aspects of my work life, right? Well, he passed away tragically kind of early. He finished some projects with us, was working on a project down in Florida, and he had a massive heart attack and passed away. And legendary guy. Well, it created a hole in the market for Bayless Boat Works. And I approached John. I said, John, I can do this work. I've worked in a sign shop. I'm a college educated designer. I've worked as a professional designer, for a decade. I can do this work. I know exactly what has to happen. He goes, well, okay, we got a boat coming up called the Budman. You can let you give that a shot. and I
What
was,
was that, like a local crab boat or something?
yeah. No, not quite. It was a '65 Bayless boat built for a client in South Carolina, Edwin Pearlstein. Captain's name was Lee Alonzo. Very well known and respected people in the community. And Budman, so his business was he was a beer distributor for Budweiser. So that hence the term the Budman.
Yeah.
To the extent that for us to paint the actual Budman graphic on the back of the boat, he had to get approval from the head office of Anheuser-Busch, and they green-lighted it, and we said, okay, we're painting Budman. So that was the first boat that I painted, and it was terrifying. First off, I refinanced my house and drew a big chunk of money out so I could afford to buy plotters and cutters and computers, which I hadn't used for years. I was really kind of rusty. So I started reteaching myself these skill sets, all these individual skill sets, and then figuring out how to combine them to do what I was tasked to do. So I'm finally tasked to do this thing, and I'm on the back of this boat painting this boat, the Budman, and I've got Captain Lee Alonzo, who was a very thorough captain. He actually knows how to read celestial navigation. You know, he can use a sextant. There's not too many guys who know how to do that. And he spent the whole time right over my shoulder just asking me one question after the other. This is the first boat I've ever painted a name on. It's a 65-foot Bayless boat. I'm terrified. And I'm going, Lee, I can't tell you what I'm doing. I've never done this before. Like, give me a break, man. You're killing me, right? So I got through that exercise, and it came out pretty good. Like, pretty good to the point that John said, okay, well, now you're the guy that paints all of our boats. And I said, okay, cool. So that kind of became my side business, and I did that work nights and weekends. I couldn't let it interfere with my job with John. At that point, I was a supervisor, and I had a fair amount of responsibility there. So it was very career-oriented, sort of burning it at both ends, and that was the beginning of Everett Nautical. And within that first year, I started getting requests to do some name work and some small projects for some other boat builders. You know, the Spencers, the Scarboroughs, Sonny Briggs, Paul Mann, the local guys. So I started kind of moonlighting as a transom sign painter for some different boat builders, Dare County, and then that expanded to some trips down into the Beaufort area, and then that expanded into some trips down to Florida, and the demand just kept expanding and expanding, to the extent that I got to a point where, where I was at with my job at Bayless Boatworks is, it was becoming very much a managerial position for me. I was a supervisor, being, and in a business that's growing, one of the things you're rewarded with when you do a good job is more work, right? More responsibility.
Right. Yep.
And so for me, a lot of that was going to be managerial roles or supervisorial roles. And I wanted to live in the aesthetic. I'm an artist. I'm a craftsman. I wanted to keep working with my hands. I didn't want to just manage people. And, if you ask people that know me and that knew me then, I was pretty mean as a supervisor. It's just, I don't know if I had too much of a personal connection to what I was doing, but I was an emotional leader, and I was kind of mean, So, and I identified that about myself. I ruled with an iron fist and was sort of militant as a supervisor. And I kind of thought about that, and then I thought about that in retrospect to me growing into a position of even greater responsibility, and I didn't see how that would fit with me. So I had to kind of make a decision that I was going to resign from Bayless Boatworks and just pursue my creative work with Everett Nautical. And, I think I walked around with a resignation notice that I had drawn up for John. I think I walked around with that for about 6 months or a year before I actually got the courage to give it to him, because there was such a connection there, and still is. And it's funny, I'm kind of getting emotional just thinking about it. That, the time was right, and I kind of presented this thing to him, and we spent the day talking about it, and he took time out of his day to really, spend time with me to figure out, how it was going to work with us moving forward. And how it ended up working is it really took me about a year or so to resign from my full-time job with John, because I didn't want to leave anybody in the lurch. I continued on doing freelance projects and helping until he was able to fulfill my old job role.
Right, because you guys had ongoing projects
A lot of stuff
that you were involved in, and your commitment.
And I wasn't going to just walk away from that. I wasn't going to burn any bridges. It was very important for me not to do that. And I have all the respect in the world for that guy, and he paved the way for everything that I do. So, it took a while to kind of fully resign from that position. And when I finally did, I did open up a workshop of my own, and I had it completely full of tools. I probably had one of the nicest cabinet shops in Dare County at my disposal that I had built. So I was doing the name work exclusively, but I was also taking on a lot of carpentry projects. I was doing a lot of woodworking stuff on my own. I started a company called Madeira Surfboards, building wooden surfboards that I was doing with a guy by the name of Dana Quinn, who his dad was kind of a legendary surfer down here. And sort of, I was exploring all these different things because I had some time on my hands. You know, I wasn't that busy as a sign painter painting names on the back of the boats. It's not like they produce 1,000 of these things a year, you know. So then what happened was this thing called Photique sort of popped up on the market, and that's simulated wood grain that's applied using paint. And one of the boat builders that I was working with had an artist in Florida that was doing some of this work, and it was some of the earliest work I saw. A woman by the name of Adair Ward. She still practices her craft. Amazing artist, nice person. Her husband's a sport fishing boat captain. And I saw her work and said, wow, that's, you know, pretty impressive stuff. And one of my clients, a boat builder in Dare County, said, well, you know, why aren't you doing that? You used to work as a woodworker. You used to install all this teak and stuff on the outside of the boats. I mean, you should be doing this. You know, we need somebody that can do this kind of stuff around here. Good teak is getting harder and harder to come by. I said, well, I guess I could figure it out. So I locked myself in my studio and I kind of worked and practiced at it for a few months and then kind of came up with some exercises that seemed okay. And I kind of went back to the builder and said, okay, I think I'm ready to give this a shot. And at that point, that was the beginning of us doing Photique on boats. And I was pretty much working solo at that point. I had some helpers, but I didn't have any full-time guys. And that pretty much took off. It's kind of become the bulk of our work at this point, is painting simulated wood grain on the exterior of yachts to look like teak, you know, to the point now where, you know, we're doing full packages on new construction boats where we're painting everything that would be in real wood. We're doing it as a simulated finish now, you know, and we've had to expand, and I have employees and a training program, and I work with a lot of people, and I've worked with people that I've started careers for them, and that's what they do now exclusively, some here in Dare County, some in Florida. And it's been a very kind of interesting journey, you know. So the strength of what we do, I think, is still like in the names, you know, because we really get to express ourselves creatively. And I think the Photique market, what we're doing now, is still something that's growing. We're advancing. You know, I'm not complacent in what I do, and I'm still not satisfied with what my results are at the moment. So I keep working at it. You know, I'm in the studio a lot, advancing, trying new techniques. I have some builders and some clients that I work with that give me the freedom and flexibility to try new things, experimental things with them on their projects, which has been, you know, a great privilege and an honor to have that kind of license, right? So that's kind of where it's at, you know, and that's what we're doing.
Man, that's awesome. And you got some cool dudes. You talked about, you know, expanding your crew, or just basically you, and in his job. So you got some cool dudes working with you, and you got awesome hats. Love the logo.
Yeah.
Love the
So
logo. Love that.
you know what I'm trying to kind of work at now is create this creative platform where there's a space that highly motivated, very creative people can come and work and do creative work and feel fulfilled and have full-time gainful employment here in Dare County, you know, doing creative work. So yeah, the people that I'm working with now all have come from a variety of different creative backgrounds: design work, set carpentry, set painting, fine art stuff, illustrators, some from the marine trades that transitioned from other things, marine carpenters, things of that nature that had a little bit of creative flair. So we're just trying to kind of figure out what that looks like, you know, and it doesn't seem like it's going to go away. I mean, the sustainability of teak wood is not really coming back, not for a while. You know, those big trees take hundreds of years to develop into these mature, old growth, big logs that we're accustomed to using. And you're not seeing as much of that wood available anymore. Now, it's going to take a couple hundred more years to catch up to that. You know, we only started replanting these trees with the early forestry programs, you know, created by the English in Burma for teak specifically about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago. And that was the first, you know, the first reforestry programs and the first tree farms were really created in Burma by the English because they recognized the value in teak. You know, I mean, teak wood drove the whole Burmese economy forever, you know. I mean, it still kind of does, right?
I'm completely ignorant of that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is highly valued, and I would imagine what little bit of wood that's out there now in the market is probably just
Well,
out of this world expensive.
it is, and it's a bit of a diminishing return on what's even available. So what we're doing, I think has merit. Not to mention it's a lot less maintenance than maintaining real wood.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
I'd like to say I'm saving a tree and I'm environmentally conscious about what I'm doing, but it's always a double-edged sword, right? The marine finishes and the paints that we use are pretty highly toxic stuff. I'm sure that they're not made in the best way, environmentally. It's a trade-off.
Right. Yeah. But it's a harsh environment that they're supposed to operate in, and you need to be able
Hold
to
up.
hold up and keep things from growing on the bottom, and it's all kinds of interesting things they're supposed to do. Interesting. So when you travel now, where do you go? Where do you like to go?
If I'm traveling for work or if I'm just traveling
to
go
for fun.
Well, I'm call me a sentimental, but I still like to try to go skiing once a year. So I have groups of friends out west, and when I say out west, I mean like the Rockies, and the Sierra Nevadas, or Canada. So I try to make at least one ski trip a year out west to visit friends and make some turns out there, if I can, for recreation. And I seek a lot of warm water environments. I'm drawn to this place because of nature. I grew up around nature in the mountains, and it shifted from being a mountain guy to a beach guy. And my connection to nature is hugely in part to my connection to the ocean. My connection to the ocean is exercise for mind, body, and spirit. It physically makes me feel good when I'm in the water, when I'm surfing, and preferably in warm water. I've done the winter surf here, and I have a threshold, and I know it, and I know my threshold. Fortunately, with our work practice, we get the opportunity to travel to some pretty nice places for work. So, if schedule allows for it, I'll try to extend the fringes of my trip a day or two and get a surf in here or there, or wherever I am. But, sometimes, as far as what I like to do for travel, I am still, I'm still a huge fan and appreciator of art and fine things. And moving from a place like New York City to a place like the Outer Banks is a bit stifling creatively, right? We don't have the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the MoMA here, or the Guggenheim. We don't have that,
no,
right? So I like to go. I like to go visit the cities or go to metropolitan areas just to get my dose of culture. Ethnic and cultural diversity, I think, is amazing. Traveling abroad whenever possible. I haven't traveled abroad in quite a while, but the last trip I did was to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands, specifically just to kind of go to some art museums, the Reich Museum, the National Museum, the Van Gogh, just to get that fix.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Look at some of the dates on some of the buildings around there.
Amazing.
There are older ones standing, but it does give you some perspective.
It does. Our country is relatively new, so our architecture is only as old as our country. You travel outside of this country, and you look at some of the architecture, and you start to study dates, and you go, wow, not only is this building still standing, it's still used as a secular building and functioning, or it's a church that people still go inside. How is that? It's pretty impressive.
Van Gogh could have stood on the cobblestone that you're standing on, or the canal cobblestones. It could have stood right there. That's how old it is, and it's pretty awesome.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the few places that I've been. London and Holland.
Yeah.
But
the flower fields and the floating flower garden in Holland is amazing. England and the whole English Isles, that's an interesting place too. I've spent some time there, and in Wales. I really enjoyed Wales, the countryside of Wales. Very working class people, just simple, nice, different. Right?
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the whatever the new season of The Crown is, when Prince Charles was in college or high school or whatever, and he was like crowned the prince, like, you're going to be the guy that takes over when the queen dies, that type of thing. And he was the Prince of Wales.
Yeah, I think he was in college. Maybe his younger brother was in high school.
I think he was in college. Yeah, and he
went in the Air Force.
And he went down there to learn. He was sent down there to learn Welsh, and learn the language. And the way they portray it in the Crown was, he really picked up appreciation for the folks down there, and and he because I think he, much like maybe Harry is now, he wanted to be maybe a little more connected to people and not so isolated, and so removed.
Yeah.
But speaking of removal, I need to remove myself from this office and go get my daughter in a few minutes. But yeah, it's like we almost need a part two. It'd be cool to talk about some stuff that you've done and talk about some other art, and definitely put it up on YouTube. That way we could slap it up on the screen. I have a young artist that I hope that'll come on soon, who's actually going out to LA to study. She's finishing up school in Mania.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, just like the world is her oyster. And it'd be cool to put that up on YouTube. That way she can throw up some of her stuff as we talk about it, and also some things that she likes that's not her stuff, that influenced her. I think that would be awesome. And but I appreciate you taking the time after a busy week and sitting down.
Thanks
Studio
for having
7.
me.
Yeah.
No, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Always good talking to you, Jimmy.
Yeah, and remember your coffee mug and your ladies tank top.
Oh, yeah. Well, how could I forget it? Well, thanks again.
Yeah, my pleasure. And we're out.